Alrighty, let's continue along. So in the last video, we talked about the student side, and you got a sense of what it's like to be a student going through the peerScholar activity. What I want to do here is just complement that by showing you the instructor side. Alright, so without any further ado, let's just get at that. Okay, so we'll start over here. This was the student side, and it's what you saw last time when I logged in. I'm going to keep this around because we'll come back to it, and I'll show you specifically the instructor side related to that. But let's, on this one in my Safari browser at the front here, I am going to log in as an instructor, and then we'll be able to see things from this side. So I'm going to use my demo at peerScholar. All right, so as you log in as an instructor, this is once again the standalone version. So just to be clear once more, if you were in the integrated version, of course, you would already be in your course shell and you would launch peerScholar from your course shell. And so you wouldn't come to this page. This page is if I were an instructor and if I were teaching a number of courses, this is a tile relevant to each of my courses where I'm using peerScholar in that course. So, you know, I can add courses and I can do some things here that you just don't have to do with the integrated version. In the integrated version, you go into your course shell and you just say you want to use a peerScholar activity, however that works within your institutional shell, and hopefully your institution has some websites to guide users. And when they do, they would pop right in to a course shell. In fact, where they would actually come in is not here. This is the listing of current activities within that course, but rather they would come in right here for the first time. If they have not yet created a course, this is what they'll see when they launch peerScholar from a faculty perspective. So what you see here when they do this is, well, here's the classic activity that we've been talking about, and that's what we're going to focus on. I mentioned the case study activity and the group work activity. Again, we're going to get there, but we're going to stay with the classic. Just before I jump in, we are going to create one from scratch. But before I do that, I just want to point out that if we have had a history with the system and we've created some activities, then they are all available to us. See, I have 73, and at any point we can just copy an activity that we've had available to us before. So if what we want to do is just reuse an activity we used in a previous term, or even maybe we want to just copy what we did in our last activity this term but then make changes, we can do that. We can just copy, and then it populates everything as it was populated for that activity, and you can either just run it as is, or you can then edit away. So you have that ability to reuse past ones. We're going to do a new activity, so we're going to essentially do it from scratch. We're going to pick a classic activity and we're going to give it a name. We'll just call this set up for new professors. So there we go, and we press create activity, and now we're going to come into a setup wizard of a sort. So there's basically three things that we can do as we go through this. There's really only one we have to do. You will see that the setting dates and the customizing grading you can do at any point in the process. Well, the setting dates has to happen before students go through, because that's to communicate the dates, but the grading you can set up at any time you wish. So you can do all three of these as part of this process, or you can just build your activity and do the other ones as you see fit. But let's go. Okay. So you see there's 3 steps across the top. We're going to focus on the build the activity. And really, most of what you need to do or want to do is available right in this page. This is what instructors are going to work with, and that is the full extent of the page. So it's not a whole lot that we're going to ask them to do. But let's step through what those things are, and then I'll show you a few of the features as we go. So here is where we might have our instructions. So please do the following, etc. And so we might describe to our students what we want them to do. If we do want to include some video or something, let me just show you that really quick. So let's say we go to video, go to YouTube rather. not as Safari fluent as I am other browsers. But if we go to YouTube and if we pick some, let's take Mission Impossible theme, why not? So let's say this was something we wanted to include for whatever reason, we can copy that URL, and then within peerScholar we could embed a video, put that URL, say OK, and what you'll see is that video is now embedded directly within peerScholar. So this is how instructors for any of the instructions can, if they want to include videos or images or whatever, they can just basically go through that process and have them in there. Similarly with attachments, you basically just click on the attachment to attach it. You can either go digging through your computer to find it. Again, anything you've used in the past is still there and can be used again. So if we wanted to use this oral rubric, there we've attached that rubric. Okay, so but that's basically it for the create phase. Give the instructions, attach the rubric. Okay, for the assess phase, to set up that, this gets a little bit more complex, but not that complex, as you'll see. We're going to introduce you to a tool that will reoccur all through the system. So, once you get comfortable with this toolbox, actually, you're comfortable with it and it's good for everywhere. So here are the questions you answer when you're setting up the assessment. So first of all, how many peers do you want each student to assess? This is actually controls two things, okay? It controls both how many peers a student is asked to assess and, assuming all the students assess, how many bits of feedback they will ultimately receive. So it's both. So this says I will assess 5 students and I should receive 5 bits of feedback after. Okay, so controls those things. Now remember, this number must be less than your total number of students, but it can be just one less. So if you have 4 students in your class, you could have them assess the other 3, and that would work fine. But you have to just keep that in mind. Now, one other thing I'll mention here when you're talking to professors about this, you can almost think of peerScholar activities as 2 activities. One is whatever the professor asked of students to do up here. So the task that the professor gave them. But also every peerScholar activity has the task of giving students constructive feedback, giving peers constructive feedback, and then ultimately responding to the feedback I receive. That's part of everyone. This number of peers is how much repetition I get with the skills while I'm doing that. All right, so I like this number to be as high as reasonable. Let me get back to reasonable. But I like it to be high because students, when they give feedback, they engage all their critical thinking, creative thinking, and they give feedback to one peer, and then they do it again for the next, and they do it again for the next. And so that repetition is really important for developing these skills. And so the higher this number is, the more repetition is going on. Now, I said reasonable because you also have to keep in mind how much work you're asking students to do. If they're reading and commenting on relatively short pieces, then asking them to do a lot of them isn't too bad. But if they're actually being asked to review something that's much longer or more onerous, is going to take more time, let's say, an honors thesis, a 20-page thesis, they're supposed to, well, you're not going to ask them to read 5 theses, right? You might only ask them to read 1 or 2. And so in a case where it's a longer piece of work, this might be a smaller number. But I like it to be a larger number when it can be. Okay, so fine, let's say let's pick 4. We'll pick 4 for our example. So we're going to ask them to assess 4 of their peers. So that means they're going to see the peer work one by one, and they're going to be able to annotate it as I showed. But we also had that little form on the right. Remember the assessment form where the instructor can kind of guide the analysis that a student is doing as they're looking at peer work. This is where you build that form, okay? And so now let me introduce you to this tool that you'll see many times, or this toolbox, I should call it, because it's a set of 8 tools. These are just assessment questions. They're different ways of well, if you've seen survey tools or anything like that, there are different ways of asking questions of a user. So like a multiple choice, for example, if we go in there, you give some which of the following. So you can, provide a prompt up here that asks students to do something, and then you can have your actual options here, and you can add options if you want. You can delete an option if you decide to, etc. And this is what students will ultimately see down here. Which of the following, and they have to pick one of these. Now with the multiple choice, they can only pick one. Okay, but it would look like that. And so let's just throw that in there, and you can keep adding these. And so, for example, a difference of a checkbox is now you can say click all that apply. Now, obviously, people aren't really going to just say click all that apply. They're going to say, considering this work and the 5 attributes of good work, which of the following attributes were present in this person's composition, let's say. But the real difference with the checkbox is that they can pick multiple, right? They can say A, B, and D were there. So they can say something like that. So we could have a checkbox in there. You're certainly almost always going to want to comment, which is the constructive feedback, right? Where you ask the student to provide some sort of constructive feedback to their peers, etc. And so you can build up this assessment form. And so I'm going to use this as an opportunity to also introduce you to this eyeball on the right here. As instructors are building their activity, they can use this eyeball, this preview, to kind of see what they've done. So for example, that little instructions with the Mission Impossible, I can see that with the rubric that I've attached. So students are going to see that. This is currently what their create phase is going to look like. I was just mucking around with the assess phase there, and we were creating these which of the following, click all that apply, there's the constructive feedback, and so you can use this to get a real sense of what the students will see when they log in. Now obviously there will be work here for each of the peers, which is not there currently because nobody submitted anything, but otherwise you can get a good sense. We'll come back to this at the very end. But this can be helpful as people are creating their assessment form to give them a good visual of what's going on. Now, you create that form. This is going to govern the questions students answer as they're assessing each peer. Okay, so this is where you can really structure their analysis. Now, at the end of that, after they've assessed their 4 peers, now they can be asked to do a self-assessment. So notice this is an option. So if I turn this off, then they will not be asked to do a self-assessment. They will only ever be asked to assess their peers, which is fine. But if you want that metacognitive hit, if you really want to push them to see their own strengths and weaknesses, then why not ask them to assess their own work as well? And then once you do that, you have the choice of either just keeping this box checked, in which case they're going to be asked the same questions of themselves that they were asked when they were looking at their peers' work, or if you prefer to change, to customize the self-assessment, you can click that to say, no, I'm not going to use the peer assessments. You start with the peer assessments, but you can then say, no, I don't want this one here. I'll keep those 2, and I'm going to add a linear scale from 1 to 5, please rate. So they have to rate something in this scale on a 1 to 5 scale. All right, and so I can make this a 5 instead of out of 7. I can put anchors on it if I want. Bad, excellent, let's say. Oops. And then this is what that'll look like. Okay. And so now you see that the self-assessment is actually different than the peer assessment. And again, if we want to flip over and look at this, this is how it's kind of building up now. We have our peer assessments. We've kept the my work. So now the student will see their own work, and the assessments they get there will be different from the assessments they get in the other pieces. Okay, cool, excellent. Instructions. So this is kind of interesting. We have created instructions already that will probably work for 98% of your instructors. The task is almost always the same. Look at your students' work, your peers' work, and assess them. And so we've kind of created generic instructions there, and if they work for the instructor, they can just leave them there. However, if they want to modify, they can do so by using the pencil. right? And they just get in there and change however they want. If they wanted to add a video, for example, I showed you ones that had videos about how to give good feedback, just like I showed you before. You can insert a video, paste in the URL, and there you go. So they can go ahead and change those instructions if they want. That's completely up to them. That's it for the assess phase. Okay, setting up the peer assessment, deciding if you want self-assessment, and then setting that up if you want it custom. And that's it. Finally, the reflect phase, the third phase. So here you have some choices. Let me show you the minimalist. The minimalist would be to turn these two things off. And so in this case, students will simply see the feedback from their peers, and that would be it. Okay, I don't recommend this. I recommend that they should be asked to do something with the feedback, and here's two things they can be asked to do. So I'm going to start on the bottom one. They can and probably should be asked to assess the feedback. Okay, and so we start with a very generic one that's pre-populated here. How useful is this peers assessment with respect to helping you improve your future work? So at the very least, they can flip that on, and students are now at least being prompted to consider how useful each bit of feedback is. But again, they can be asked to go through and assess that feedback in a much richer way. And once again, the instructor has control of it. So using tools from this toolbox, the instructor can choose prompts that they want students to answer with respect to each bit of feedback they receive. Okay, and so you can keep adding to those as you want. Let me show you, by the way, the matrix, because this is a more complicated one. Let's say we had a feedback, check the feedback rubric. So let's say there was a rubric of what constitutes good feedback. Apologies, I can't think and type. So for example, remember that one where I said the person giving the video said there was 5 characteristics of good feedback. We saw a little bit of this before. One of them was, not personal, making it not personal. Whoops, excuse me. So we could say, how well did the person do? Another one was that sandwich approach. Okay. And we could say, okay, for each of those, how many levels? Well, I don't know, maybe we had 5 levels. So this is poor, and this could be great, etc. And you'd put in things all through this. But what people will ultimately get then is a matrix where they can put in their ratings directly in the matrix that reflects their reaction to the feedback. So that one tool, we could put that in, we could save that, and that becomes another thing students would be asked to fill out as they assess feedback. Okay, so pretty straightforward there. I think you have control over that process. Now, once they've assessed the feedback for each of, in this case, the 4 peers, because that's what we set up there, now they can be asked to use that feedback to revise and resubmit. So, go ahead and change your work and resubmit. So I also recommend doing this whenever possible. This is what's called a formative use of feedback, giving the opportunity to students to immediately use the feedback to improve their work and potentially get a better grade. So that's a really good thing to do. Okay. Instructions, same story as with assess. We have generic ones that will almost always work really well. I didn't emphasize this above, but these generic ones actually are sensitive to what you choose here. So for example, let's say this revise and resubmit. So look at what it says here. Once you have assessed the feedback in detail, it's time to use it to improve. Toggle on the revision screen and you'll see a copy of your original composition. Go ahead. So all of that is only going to show up if you're asking them to do that. If you're not asking them to do that, you'll see that part of the instructions disappeared. Okay. So once again, these instructions can be pretty much used as is, and they will ensure that students get a good, clear description of what they're asked to do that fits the activity well. And instructors need not edit them at all, but should they desire to, click the pencil, off you go. Okay, good. All right, this is the standard thing that faculty have to do. Those 3 things: add instructions, create your peer assessments, decide what you want to do with self-assessment, and then look at the reflect phase and decide if you want them to assess the feedback and how, and whether you want them to revise. And that's essentially all you have to do. And the activity has been specified. I've shown you the eyeball where you can look. Now, what I didn't show you is that, on the reflect phase as well, it's showing you what you're building there in the same way. So you can see that. And so you can get at all three of the phases from this pretty well. All right, now, two other things I want to show you about this before we leave and go further. And one is this plus sign, additional assessments. Remember when I showed you the student side and I said you can have questions that appear at the end of each phase after they've done the main task, but before they're allowed to actually kind of submit and log out. These are the so-called additional assessments, and you control those here. It's once again the same toolbox, but you can grab any one of these and create what you want. But the interesting distinction here is, I don't know, let's say we're asking them to grade their own work. What grade would you give yourself? And so we can create a little question of any type we want. Let's say we ask them to give themselves a grade out of 20, whole numbers only, sure. Okay, and so now you've created this question, but look what now happens. It says, okay, you've created this question. Which phase do you want to connect this to? And you can in fact connect it to multiple. So we could say after they've submitted, we want to ask them what grade they would give themselves. But also after they've revised, we also want to ask them that same question. So that's step 3. Okay, so for any of these additional assessments, you can create any question you want and then attach it to any phase you want, including multiple phases. And then that becomes something that's just associated with that phase. As it goes. Okay, and so here you see that question now is there. So when they go to that question, they get that. What grade yourself? Well, that's good grammar. So that's the idea. So now this reflect phase has these 2 steps, and you can see those 2 steps. Okay, excellent. Very powerful for research. All sorts of things you can do with these additional assessments. Also, if somebody says, well, I wish after this happened that students were asked to do this or whatever, go ahead, man, make it what you want it to be. I'll also mention quickly while we're on this that there are some additional advanced settings connected to each of the phases. So things like, do you want a word limit? And if you do want a word limit, how many words you want this to be? So maybe 400 words. Do you want them to be able to include attachments? You could say, nope, I don't want any attachments. I just want it to be the text box, and that's it. Do you want them, once they submit, to be able to come back in and edit? You can decide. So again, this is the create phase. Now the assess phase has slightly different settings. For example, anonymity. By default, everything's anonymous in peerScholar, but it doesn't have to be. You can flip this, and then students will see the identity of the person that they're assessing here. And if you do it in this phase, they will see the identity of the person who gave them feedback. Okay, so you can control things like that. Again, the editing. Also, do you want to insist that they do a previous phase before they go to the next phase? So you see we're getting into sort of more minutia, but it's a way that the power user can control the context a little bit more. So if we kind of step back a little bit, our philosophy here with faculty is let's try to make it as easy as possible for them to create an effective activity. And they do that just by doing these 3 parts that I highlighted here. But for the power users who want to make it dance in a slightly more sophisticated way, then through the settings and through the additional assessments, you have a lot of power to really customize the activity to be what you wish. Okay, we've created an activity. Cool. The next thing we often do is set up the dates. When do we want this activity, the phases of the activity to happen? And there's sort of two modes you can have. You can schedule them, so you have specific things opening and closing at specific times, and let's just take a look at that. So for the create phase, you can just say I want it to open the 29th, close the 31st, and so this will do just generic days, start of day, end of day. You can also get in there and play with the time if you want to actually, get much more specific on the times. You can also allow them to submit late if you want. So even if this phase is already open, if someone hasn't completed the create phase and they try to do the assess, if you have submit late on, like that, they will be told, well, you can't yet. You have to first complete the create, and it'll send them back to the create phase, allow them to complete what they have to do there, submit, then they can get into the assess. Okay, and notice that we also have a submit late for the final one. After the end, we don't have one for the assess, and we don't have one because it's a very difficult thing to do. To have people assessing at the same time as other people are receiving their feedback, what you really need to happen is for the class, and as much of the class as possible, to complete their assessments on time. And so sometimes I will be very strong about that. I will say you must complete it on time, or you risk getting 0 on the entire activity. For every student who does not complete their assessment, whatever that student value was, like we had 4 peers here, 4 peers they would receive 1 less piece of feedback. And so we don't want that, and that's why we'd really like people to complete their assessment. Just to let you know, there's also a manual mode for scheduling. So in the manual mode, from the control panel that I'll show you in a moment, you can just open and close the phases by yourself without any date or time. Just you decide, okay, I want control create close now, I want assess open, and you can do that. Okay, cool. That is the core of the setup. The last thing I want to do, I'm skipping grading because grading deserves a video of its own. Okay, so I'm going to come back to grading, but I'm just going to leave that for now. So I'm going to save and close here and now. And so this is the control panel. You'll see that in a moment. I'm going to jump to one of the activities, one of these guys. Okay, so remember these activities that we saw from the student side? I just want to show you now what that looks like from the instructor side. So that activity that we went through, here is the instructions with the rubric that was attached, with the videos that are embedded. In that one we had 5 peers, and here's how we set up their peer assessment and their self-assessment. And remember we did things like had videos embedded in the instructions. So we had actually edited the instructions and embedded videos in it. So that was that one. Remember we had all those additional assessments at the end. We had a couple after the create phase. We had one after the assess phase. This was the consent. And we had that justification of revisions. So that's there. So again, just to show you that I don't think there was anything fancy in the features. Oh, they did have a word limit set there. And anonymity was off in this case, which I didn't notice. Okay, etc. So that's what it looks like from the instructor side. It's actually very simple and easy to set up. Okay, and I think that's really the punchline of that for when you're interacting with instructors, to say, I'll help you for your first 1 or 2, but you'll very quickly find that it's extremely easy to set up. In fact, if you load in that previous activity as I showed you and then just modify, it's easier still. Okay, just before we leave you on this video, I just wanted to mention the following. You can at any time. I mean, if you have the integrated version, you can play with your integrated version. You can also go to app.peerscholar.com and register an account, and you can play with the instructor side. You can set up an activity and try things out. I just want to mention if any of you guys, the natural desire is, okay, I set up an activity, let's test it. Testing is a little tricky in peerScholar, and I just wanted to make you aware of that. So the assumption with peerScholar is that you have this cohort of students going through. And so let's say we have 10 students going through. That number has to be bigger than the number of peers you're asking each student to assess. And as long as that's true, everything will work fine. But when you're testing it, this causes a little bit of annoyance because you've set it all up, and let's say you've set the peers to 4, just like we did. And so now you want to try it out. Well, you're going to need 5 people to submit something and create, and then 5 people to assess, and then 5 people to do the reflect phase. So either you have to find P+1 friends and ask them to serve as students in your test, or you yourself will have to simulate that. So you will have to log in as student 1, then as student 2, then student 3, student 4, etc. So a little bit onerous, but if you keep in mind that's what the system is assuming, that it's a cohort moving through, not an individual, then that makes sense. Okay, so cool. You should have everything you need to know now to start playing with peerScholar, to start creating activities, and maybe to start running through them. One of the things we could do during one of our online sessions that's going to be coming up at the end is maybe go through an activity together. I can show you the manual mode, and we could actually be students and go through it, and I'll give you a sense ahead of time before we get there of how we will do that. Okay, cool. Excellent. The next chapter or the next module in the videos is going to be all about taking what you know now and me giving you some tips about how you can really up the pedagogical game in very simple ways. So I look forward to talking to you about that. Till then, have a great day.